Slava.
Hello, Olivier. How are you?
Bonjour, Slava. I am fine. I hope you are also fine.
Thank you. Cheers from wintry, cold, and snowy Moscow. It's the most cold time of the year.
Yeah, I know. In Kiev, in Ukraine also, it's very cold and a lot of snow. Well, first of all, I am very happy that you accepted to do this interview. And then I think maybe you have to present you in few words for our YouTube TV channel auditors.
Thank you, Olivier, for inviting me. Would you like me to?
Yeah, because
to tell your viewers who I am, or?
This video will be also in the West, in Western Europe, in English, part in French. Then I think a lot of person want to know you in France and in the West in general, in England.
Well, a quick snapshot of my life story, so to speak. I was born and grew up in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. In 1966, and I lived there during the old Soviet days, throughout all of the Soviet Union until 1988, when at the age of 22 I immigrated from the USSR for good and came to New York, and that's where I lived for 8 years until 1996. The reason why I came back to Russia and not to St. Petersburg, but rather to Moscow quite a long time ago by now, in 1996, after 8 years in New York, was because I received a job offer from somebody whom some of your viewers, and definitely you, would know at least by name. This person was Bill Browder, the founder of the Hermitage fund, which was to be launched at that time as a joint venture with a prominent Israeli-US banker, by now late Edmund Safra, who was the founder and majority shareholder of Republic National Bank of New York. And at that time, I already got my MBA degree from Stern School of Business at New York University, where I studied from 94 through 96. And this was exactly the time when there were various privatization programs in Russia, and the so-called privatization vouchers were turned into company shares, and by 95 and mostly 96, they began trading on the Russian stock exchange. That was a real amazing and exciting frontier market, never before tried or invested into by any of the international investors, because Russia was under the communism and dictatorship regime for over 7 decades. And that was the first time when the old Soviet companies and the more modern Soviet companies and some of the companies that were started anew became not only private, but also were turning into public companies with shares traded on the exchange. And that's how I ended up back in Russia as a US citizen. I received a Russian citizenship as well, and that's a kind of a by-side note here, because when I immigrated from the USSR, all of the people who were in my shoes were stripped of the Soviet citizenship by force. I could not leave the USSR to live somewhere else permanently with the remaining the Soviet citizen, I had to exchange my citizenship and passport in exchange for the exit visa, which I had to get. So until 1995, I didn't have any citizenship whatsoever. I had a green card in the U.S. Then I received citizenship in the U.S., American citizenship. And then within a month from that, I received Russian citizenship because of the presidential decree which Yeltsin signed. Based on that decree, such people as myself who were born and lived within this Russian Socialist Federative Republic, so one of the 15 republics comprising the Soviet Union. So whoever lived on the territory, were born and lived on the territory of what became the Russian Federation after the dissolution of the USSR, were eligible to get Russian citizenship of the Russian Federation, which I did. So from a completely stateless person whom I was for 7 years, in 1995, I received 2 citizenships, 1 month apart. And since then, I live and work in Moscow. I worked at Hermitage for 4 years, and then I launched my own ventures, and we, in a partnership with some people from the Russian Forbes list, that was right after the Hermitage. And then in 2004, I launched my own venture, which is called Diamond Age Capital Advisors. This is a fund management company domiciled in the Cayman Islands, and this company manages 2 hedge funds, and we are looking to launch a third one. Within this close professional finance community in Russia, it was not really common for anybody to speak up, especially on political issues, and also within the close-knit and secretive hedge fund community, it was also not a common thing to share some sacred investment ideas or any opinions which may influence these ideas, unless you want to do it on purpose to talk up or to talk down any of the positions in your portfolio. So I was not a public person, and I was not going to become one until 2014. In fact, before that, I was very much a usual guest at the Russian business television channel, which is called RBC. I was a commentator on the Russian Business FM radio with bi-weekly accidental telephone interviews, which then millions of people listen to in their cars while driving in traffic jams in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But I was not a public person apart from that, apart from communicating my economic, financial markets views when I was asked. But then 2014 came. Russia launched a war against Ukraine. Russia annexed Crimea and occupied it. Russia invaded east of Ukraine and shot down the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, where 298 people died. And these were events which were also accompanied by a Russian Putin engineered Goebbels-style propaganda on all of these state-owned television channels by that time, there were no independent television channels in Russia whatsoever. Putin destroyed and took over all of them. And the propaganda which followed this war against Ukraine was so shocking. None of us, the generations here that are of either same age as we are or even older, none of them witnessed anything like that, because this was really Hitler-like Goebbels-style propaganda of the 1930s and early 40s of the last century. Apart from the horror that people like myself were experiencing of what was going on with Russia and the route that Putin was dragging Russia along, I also understood what that would mean for the Russian stock market and the Russian financial markets in general. The Russia's international standing and its ability to borrow cheap money in the West, like it used to over many years. What would happen to the economy because of that, and what in fact would be the course of events based on the expected by me and by many others international sanctions against Russia and against Putin's regime. And I wrote a couple of posts in my Facebook account. Now, as I said before, I was not a public person, and by that time, I only had one Facebook account with no Twitter, no Telegram channel, nothing of that sort, just a Facebook page, and where I had 200 friends, of whom I personally knew about 100, and I had no idea who the other 100 was, and I logged into my Facebook only twice a week, maybe before that. And so I explained in my short text in around July and August of 2014 what would happen next to the Russian financial markets, Russian economy, and all of us because of the upcoming international sanctions. And the consequences, as I argued then, would not only be based on the concrete sanctions of what we get on day X or on day Y or on day Z, but also on the expectations of the international financial community, expectations among international investors of where Russia would actually go and what future sanctions might look like, because you invest in a country with certain country risks associated with that, based on some of the expectations. But if you know that this company or this person are sanctioned and you cannot invest in this company, or you cannot do business with that person, that doesn't mean that it's safe to invest in those who are not sanctioned, because you invest in that company or do some joint venture with that person, and all of a sudden you're caught with your pants down because at that time in the middle of your transaction they are sanctioned.
Yeah, I understand totally.
And this short post of mine became viral on Facebook, which I have never seen before. None of my texts before, if I wrote any, were actually reposted. As you understand, and as your audience understands, the importance in the Facebook statistics is not the number of likes that you get, because you can write any kind of crazy stuff there and get a lot of likes because of the hype. But what is important is the number of reposts that your post is getting. So how many times it is actually being transmitted to other Facebook users. And this post had an astonishing number of reposts. And I saw that, and I actually wrote the next, or the day after the next, I wrote a very detailed text, which was based on my research, which I've done within my company, which was basically a research on how other countries in the world were living under sanctions, what kind of problems that they had internally, and also what kind of problems various institutions had externally because of the global regulation and laws, and because also of the specifically US laws and regulations on the financial institutions who are in violation of a sanction regime of this country or of that country. And so I only took 5 previous years of the consequences which various global financial institutions, banks such as HSBC, BNP Paribas, Standard Bank, you name it, what they faced in the US alone when, for one reason or another, they breached some of the sanctions, maybe in Sudan or North Korea or these kind of countries. The resulting number was astonishing. Over the last 5 years, leading to 2014, the combined amount of fines and settlements that these banks paid to the US government was actually around $20 billion.
Wow.
And when you talk about these kind of numbers, you understand that these bankers, they maybe are in for a transaction or in financing program or in some other type of banking business with this or that country which is under sanctions, and they may, for example, receive $50 million in revenues out of this transaction, where let's say X of that amount of 50 million is their net profit. And based on what they've done, knowingly or unknowingly, they end up paying $1.2 billion in fines to the US government. Obviously, none of the shareholders of such institution would actually, bear agree to bear that kind of risk. They would fire top managers, CEOs, COOs, and so on, and hire other ones, because this would not be an acceptable way of doing business. And my main conclusion to that was that regardless of the level of sanctions and what they are, Russia would become toxic because of the expectations of the international financial community that Russia is in this spiral of this worsening sanctions. So I wrote all of that in a very detailed way. This post became extra mega viral for me. It was reposted tens of thousands of times, maybe partially also because none of the people saw in me a person who would go public in any of this kind of stuff. And then people started, asking for interviews, and I gave interviews, and all of a sudden it became a kind of a celebrity in terms of my segment of professional activity. None of others.
Okay, I understand.
Nobody became public, and so this is how it all started. And then I started writing about economics, politics. I became a very outspoken public person to not only criticize Putin. Criticizing Putin is a very soft way of explaining what I say about Putin. I say that he's a mass murderer, he's a serial killer, he's an international terrorist, and he is a war criminal.
Okay.
And he is a mega mega thief.
I understand you. And I know you then, but for our audience, it's very good that you present you globally and your work and your position. And I know that you are a celebrity in economy and finance in Russia. But now I have some question to for you. How do you estimate the outcome of the last protests in Russia?
I'm sorry, how would I estimate what?
The outcome of
The
the last
outcome. Oh,
protest.
the outcome. Okay, okay. Um, Olivier, it's a very good and extremely complicated question because Russia ceased to be a state. There is no longer a state as we know it. There is no government, there is no parliament. So how the Russian Federation works according to the constitution, there are three branches of power: executive, then parliament, and the judicial system. Putin dismantled all of them. He also dismantled the unofficial fourth branch of power, the independent media. And obviously any type of peaceful transfer of power is theoretically based on the construction of how the state operates according to its constitution. And based on that, you can analyze political movements, maybe protests, maybe some candidates for the upcoming elections. But all of this is dismantled in Russia. There are no elections. There are no political leaders who are independent and allowed to take part in the elections. There is no president. The institute of presidency is destroyed. There is no government. These are just the puppets that Putin is using. There is no parliament, and there is a parliament, but it's not a parliament. There is a complete lack of the judicial system. It has been dismantled and was dismantled. And there are no free and fair elections. And anybody who would question Putin's right to continue his endless rule ends up either in prison or abroad or killed or under the threat of assassination. And we can obviously see that by the most recent, by now the world known, across the world known story of Alexei Navalny. So when you ask about the potential outcome, nobody will tell you. And if somebody says to you that they know, they lie. There is no mechanism to predict.
Then you think it's not possible to achieve more? You think that now we are like in the end of a system?
No, there is certainly there is a possibility to achieve more and much more. I'm just saying that nobody knows by now how Putin's regime will collapse and when, and what would be the mechanisms to it. It might collapse over time when the situation with mass protests will paralyze many facets of the Russian political life and economy. So there will be this split among the so-called elites. The Russian economy might be paralyzed due to mass demonstrations and maybe refusal to go to work as a sign of protests and so on. we have no idea what will happen in the future in this respect from the ground up. We also could imagine the situation when there is a coup at the very top. And in fact, I say that the possibility of a coup is actually more likely, not because I just say so, but only based on the entire history of Russia dating back from from now throughout the entire history of the Soviet Union and of the Tsarist Russia. In fact, the so-called revolution of 1917, as it used to be called during the Soviet times, the Great Soviet Socialist Revolution, that was no way a revolution even called at the time by the Bolsheviks. They themselves, these communists, these Bolsheviks, they were calling this a coup d'etat, the October of 1917 coup. Mm-hmm. That was after the February Revolution, which happened in February of 2017, when the people surrounding the Tsar made him to give up the throne, and they actually ended the Romanovs' monarchy from top down, not from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. So that was the, in fact, this kind of a revolution from the top. Then you go throughout the history of the Soviet Union and various dark periods of its history. The death of Stalin in 1953, as now it is, most plausibly argued, was not due to natural causes.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And that was also a certain coup from the top. And not talking about, obviously, the period of 1985-1991, when Gorbachev, knowingly or unknowingly for himself, but from the top, gradually dismantled the Soviet Union by 1991. So in none of these cases, there were any kind of revolutions from the bottom up, where you actually saw, like in the movies, you saw like running people, soldiers and seamen running to take over the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in 1917. There was nothing of that sort. So based on that, I don't know. For at least for me, it is equally plausible that the Putin's regime would be also would collapse and will be then dismantled by either from bottom up or top down. But nobody can tell you for sure. Nobody knows. There are no mechanisms to predict that. The state itself is actually destroyed and dismantled by now.
Can you share your opinion on what is weak and what is strong in the Russian anti-Putin movement now?
Well, you're asking very good questions, Olivier, and maybe right to the point. Based on the 70-year plus history of the Soviet Union, there were generations and generations and after generations produced people that no longer comprised any kind of political nation, in a sense of a nation, and as you would say in the West, a political nation. Mm-hmm. So the word solidarity is not the word that you would say or even think of when you talk about people at large, mm-hmm. about the population. People got used to living under the regime where they were actually almost like slaves of the system, slaves of the regime. They completely lacked any kind of understanding how the state is actually not only working, but who is financing that state. They were not taxpayers. And so during they were obviously taxpayers, but they didn't realize that. In the Soviet Union, their taxes were subtracted at source. They already were receiving the net money after taxes. And unfortunately, the same tax regime and the same mechanism drifted from over the Soviet Union to post-Soviet Russia now. Most of the people who are not self-employed, they do not realize what kind of taxes they are paying. They only receive net money after tax from their employers, and their employers are agents for them to pay taxes. So you have no political nation, you have no consciousness of a taxpayer. You only sit there silently and pray that next year is not going to be worse than this year in terms of the oppression, and thanks God there is no war and no BS like that. So this obviously is changing, but it is changing very slowly. And before this weakness, as you asked about, is overcome by the slow kind of natural process, we would not have a political nation which may come out in the streets and say enough to a serial killer, war criminal, international terrorist, mega thief in power. Enough of that. And actually arrest him and put him on trial. There will be a very, very long road to that. And that is the most important thing, this political nation building. This is the most important weakness that has to be overcome. And in fact, knowingly or unknowingly, but you being, in the heart of events in Ukraine, you probably understand too that Putin, without any knowledge of that to himself, he was one of the founders of the Ukrainian political nation. Obviously, Ukraine made a very long way from being part of the Soviet Union throughout all of these years. It had its own ups and downs. It had peaceful and sometimes non-peaceful transfers of power, but at least Ukraine by now, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has a very decent number of different heads of state that were presidents of Ukraine. But still, the people of Ukraine at large were not a political nation in its kind of democratic Western sense by 2014. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine, then this Ukrainian nation building began at such a huge pace that was unbelievable how Ukrainian political nation was born right there. And one of the most positive things about the events back then was, in fact, the birth of the actual, the real Ukrainian political nation. That was the trigger which expedited this historical process and jammed it into several months, which probably naturally would have taken many, many years. We don't know what kind of events are ahead of us in Russia, But I think that the same processes may take place in Russia, where political nation in some shape or form would also be born here.
But for you, what needed to make the opposition in Russia more effective? You think that we have only to wait for something, or we can do something to make this opposition more effective?
Nobody is waiting for anything. So we have various opposition leaders who are being driven, to the ground, to jail, to home arrest, and so on and so forth. But I would say that none of them have the standing, popularity, or merit to actually call themselves political leaders, in a sense that they actually want and are capable of taking power in Russia. Nobody among them would challenge Putin directly for presidency in a real way, not in a kind of puppet way, except for one figure. This one figure is Alexei Navalny. Now, you may like or dislike Navalny, but regardless of that, he is the only person who was able to build a huge political organization which was meant to be a political party, but it has never been registered as a political party because Putin's regime does not allow this organization to be registered as a party. They tried a dozen times to do that. It's extremely expensive process to register a party. You must have an all Russia meeting of party delegates. Then it's all these are expensive processes. They tried a dozen times. Obviously gave up because there is no way it would be registered under Putin. But in any case, this is an organization like any very strong political party anywhere in the world, in the normal world, would be. It has several organizations. It has the so-called fund, the Anti-Corruption Fund, and it has a Moscow chapter, St. Petersburg chapter, regional chapters, and so on. But also it has Navalny has another organization which is called regional, how would I say, региональные штабы Навального, the regional headquarters of the Navalny organization. You may, translate it that way. They are located in dozens and dozens of Russian cities all across Russia, from Kaliningrad in the west to Vladivostok in the east, spanning 12 time zones, and obviously with the headquarters with chapters in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and with members and with activists and so on. This kind of organization is not even achieved, in my opinion, by the oldest opposition political party, which is called Yabloko, led by Grigory Yavlinsky, an economist and political leader of, dating back to the early 90s. I believe that he and his party, with the almost 30-year history, has done just a fraction of what Navalny was able to achieve within just the last 10 years, give or take. So I think that this unification, unifying effort by Navalny and his organizations and his his comrades in arms and his activists, is the only real political opposition force now. And he is the only guy who is now in jail. He's the only guy who can get a population at large to go out in the streets. And in fact, he demonstrated that many times over. And just recent events of the 23rd of January and of the 31st of January and the 2nd of February were in fact breaking all historic records in terms of how many people were in the streets and where. Because on January 31st, people came out all across Russia in almost 180 cities across Russia for the total number of maybe 300,000 people when you count all of these cities. This has never happened in the post-Soviet Russia. It never happened during the Soviet days, obviously.
Of course.
And in fact, I'm not sure that it ever happened in the Tsarist Russia, in pre-revolutionary Russia, to have 300,000 people demonstrating in 180 cities across the Russian Empire. I wouldn't be able to name you such an event back then.
But for you, your estimation on whether Putin's regime is in real crisis that threatens its own existence, or that point of view is too optimistic? Do you think that really the Putin regime is at the end, or the crisis is inside the Putin regime, or?
Putin's regime is definitely in crisis. But we don't know whether this crisis will, bury this regime from the inside. I think that this regime is much more tend to survive various degrees of crisis, and I'll tell you how and why I think so. But definitely, Putin's regime in its worst political crisis ever, because Putin ordered Navalny killed. He used the state secret service, which is the heir to KGB. It is called FSB, Federal Security Service, to kill Navalny. The assassination attempt took place on the 20th of August of last year, just a few months ago, and it was documentally and without any doubt proven that Putin used internationally banned chemical weapons to do it. He used a poisonous chemical agent Novichok, which is internationally banned to research, produce, store, and use. So Putin and his regime are in violation of Russia's international obligations under the treaty of which banned chemical weapons. This is now a proven fact, regardless of what Putin himself and his cronies and criminals around him are saying. This is an internationally known fact, even in fact confirmed by the Organization for Banning the Chemical Weapons. It was confirmed by several independent laboratories in different countries where samples of Navalny's blood and other samples were sent and analyzed, these laboratories are certified, and they're part of the International Organization for Banning Chemical Weapons. So it's a fact. And Navalny survived. Navalny survived this assassination attempt by a combination of very happy circumstances, basically a miracle. And I would not name all of these circumstances by now. Probably all of your viewers to this or that extent would know the details from not only from the Russian independent media, internet kind of based sources, but also from all of the international media sources, such as CNN and BBC and so on and so forth. And then Navalny investigated his own near-death experience and assassination attempt on his life with the help of investigative journalists, which comprised the whole syndicate. That was investigative journalist organization called Bellingcat. They also added various big media companies because they obviously knew that it's gonna add to the weight of their investigation, because such media companies actually never publish anything which is unproven, which is gray area. They may be liable for damages and prosecution. Therefore, they would confirm and reconfirm and check and double check all of the details. So the consortium also included CNN, Der Spiegel, and Alpai, and the Russian media, which is called The Insider. And so all of this all together with Bellingcat actually solved the crime of assassination attempt against Navalny's life. And then Navalny himself, out of the coma, during his rehabilitation process in Germany, he joined this consortium. He took part in the further investigation, and then he played the biggest ever, the 21st century prank on the telephone.
Yeah, I saw that.
He and Hristo Grozev of Bellingcat actually called on the telephone one of the assassins who were part of that team, and he started talking with them, and it took over an hour, I think, for them to talk about that, where this the member of the assassins team had no idea that this was Navalny. He thought that he was that person whom Navalny impersonated himself by the assistant of the most close Putin's crony, Nikolai Patrushev, who is the secretary of the so-called the Council on Security or something like that. So anyway, the reason why this person actually was not being able to recognize Navalny's voice, and then he probably breached all of the instructions that he ever had in his career by that telephone call, is very simple. When Navalny called every other member of this team, they refused to speak with him on the open telephone line, and some of them also said, "No, you're not that person. We know who you are," and they were hanging up the phone. And this guy was the only guy who actually got afraid, got scared that he would refuse to speak with a very, very big boss in his organization. And therefore he started doing that. And the explanation to that is very simple. All of the people, all of these murderers on this team, except for one, are trained FSB officers. This only guy was not trained as an FSB officer. He was not in FSB school or higher school or whatever it's called. He was a trained military specialist in chemical warfare, and was the only guy on the team who was not career FSB guy.
And you know also that the doctor in Omsk died those last days, and this is also very strange, you know, because like that you have no proof.
Extremely strange death at the age of 52, something like that. Mm-hmm. And now Bellingcat and Hristo Grozev came out with further investigations on who else might have actually been under attempts to assassinate and survive. And we can name several people, and you know their names. But they're also, they came out with the investigation who would have been the others who were actually killed, assassinated, and not survived. And this is all out. Now the whole world understands what Putin actually does. And this has never happened before. Obviously, you can say that Putin is a war criminal because he killed 15,000 people in Ukraine. He downed a civil jet over eastern Ukraine, the Boeing flight MH17. But, you know, this has never gotten the critical mass of actually the civilized world slapping personal sanctions on Putin and actually putting him on the international arrest warrant until now. Now it is proven that Putin is a mass murderer, serial killer, who uses chemicals, who use chemical weapons on his own citizens. This is type of a criminal whom would I, only recall, apart from Bashar Assad, but I would recall Saddam Hussein and his, I believe that was his cousin, who was known internationally as Chemical Ali. Mm-hmm. That guy, military guy in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, he was using chemical weapons against the Kurds, and nothing good happened to Saddam Hussein and Chemical Ali over time. I think that Putin is actually slowly digging his way towards the same end. Hopefully he does. Hopefully.
Yes, but you speak about the sanction. The sanction, no, in 2014 we started some sanctions. Do you think these sanctions are effective? Do you think these sanctions they have an impact on the Russian society? Do you think that those sanctions are relevant? They are affecting only the population or also the Kremlin authorities?
Sanctions are not effective in a way that they've been introduced and slapped on Russia. And I have been saying that all along. And now I believe the Western and entire international community is coming to realization. For example, in 2014, there were several layers of sanctions which were building up gradually along as Russia was moving along this, criminal path of aggression against Ukraine. There were sanctions based on the annexation of Crimea. then sanctions based on the war in eastern Ukraine, and there were sanctions of a higher level for downing the civil aircraft, Boeing flight MH17. And there were also personal sanctions against some of the Putin's close allies, friends, and cronies, but there were not a huge number of them. Now, Putin introduced the so-called counter sanctions.
Yes, and what do you think about those counter sanctions in response?
And what happened is that Putin banned all imports of all types of food into Russia from those countries, which previously put sanctions against Russia, as Putin would say, but it's against his regime, obviously, not against Russia. So what Putin actually did, he sanctioned his own people. He banned the imports of these types of food from those countries, and we no longer can buy high quality cheese. There is no Parmesan. There is no anything of that sort. And obviously that was extremely profitable to Putin's cronies, who by then already owned major production facilities where they produced fish, meats, cheese of much lower quality, and they were competing with international products freely with on the price level.
Yeah.
Now they became monopolists, and they can continue with the same shitty quality what they produce, but they can charge higher prices, and in some cases much higher prices. So the food inflation in Russia, because of that, skyrocketed from 2014 and onwards, and it is extremely high. And in some of the cases, in some of the line items of foodstuffs that ordinary Russians actually buy, some of the prices in rubles actually doubled only within just one last year. So Putin is actually sanctioning its own people. It's criminal. It is.
I know, but I totally agree. And what for you is finally the impact of those financial sanctions against certain senior Russian leader are effective, or this is only like a sword strike in the water?
No, it's not effective. And in fact, only about, I believe a couple of days ago, the state-owned company Gazprom, which is one of Putin's biggest cash pockets, borrowed in the international markets, if I remember that correctly, $6 billion by issuing Eurobonds at the interest rate of 1.5%. What kind of sanctions are you talking about? Even financial sanctions? No. In 2014, I said, and I continue to say that, in 2014, if the international community, USA, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, European Union, if they would have introduced sanctions, personal sanctions against Putin's friends, and they would have been adding, let's say, 50 names on this personal sanctions list per month, by the end of year one, there would have been 600 Putin's cronies on a personal sanctions list with their assets frozen in the West. And you continue that in year two, and you do the same thing, 50 people a month. And by the end of year two, there would have been no Putin in the Kremlin, no Putin, because the expectation of the most influential people with money, people on the Forbes list, people who are thieves, people who are benefiting from the Putin's corruption regime. The expectations that they would have had that they would end up on the sanctions list, if not this month, but then next month or month after, that would have caused the split among them, and they would have done something to Putin that they then would have said what they've done. There would have been no more Putin.
Yeah, I agree. Like, yeah, I was in favor of, to ban Russia from, this all the payment online, and that will be more effective. But at the result, I agree with you that those sanctions are not very effective because the target is not. Nemtsov say we must not target the people, but target some party of some headquarter next Putin. But that's why.
Olivia, there are only about maybe, I have no idea exactly what would be the number, but let's say that there are just about 10,000 families in Russia who are the primary beneficiaries of the Putin's regime. Out of 146 million people in Russia, only 10,000 families are the real beneficiaries of Putin's kleptocracy. And you can, this is the weak point and also strong point of Putin's regime. If you don't do anything with these 10,000 families, then the regime is very, very stable. Because, and you ask whether it is in a crisis and may collapse because of that. As I said before, the regime is in the most dangerous, the biggest ever political crisis right now because of the events of the last several months. But it is extremely stable because there is a regime is based purely on kleptocracy. There is, you name it, anything that you would throw as an example, the Nord Stream 2, all of these projects, they are not economically, viable for Russian taxpayers and for Gazprom as a company, for example. This is all just a way of circumvent the transportation of the Russian gas via Ukraine and punish Ukraine kind of economically that way. But it has no economic and financial merit. However, it has huge economic and financial merit for Putin's friends who actually got the contracts to build these pipelines. So Gazprom, which is state-owned, is not working for its shareholders, for the Russian people, for the taxpayers. It is working for Putin's cronies who take out the contracts from Gazprom and bury these pipes in the ground at the prices which are several times over the market price for this kind of work, to build a pipeline which itself is not needed because Russia has no gas capacity to fill all these pipes. And we are talking about the regime which is, the entire purpose of Putin's regime. There are actually two of them, and there are no others. The first purpose of the existence of Putin's regime is to commit crimes, including obviously all of the crimes associated with the kleptocracy and grand theft on which regime is built. So the purpose of this regime is to commit crimes. And the second purpose of this regime is to evade any kind of responsibility, any kind of consequences to committing these crimes. So this is like a spiral. You commit various crimes, you are escaping the consequences and responsibility, which leads you to further crimes. And further crimes are left with no responsibility for committing them. And then leads to further crimes. And then you get to actually killing or trying to kill your political opponents with internationally banned chemical weapons. And you may end up with further and more, grave crimes. So this must be stopped. And Russian people alone cannot stop that at that point. The international community must help the Russian people to stop that.
That you say the Russian community outside, the diaspora?
No, the international community.
International community, excuse me. Okay.
Yes.
And for you, to end with the sanction, very few words. What do you think when we wanted to ban Russia from the SWIFT system?
The SWIFT system is just, I said that back in 2014 during my, when Russian some of the remaining online independent media started asking for interviews. I said, you down one more plane, you kill a few thousand more Ukrainians, we'll end up with no SWIFT here. And I was saying all that, and then I got banned from the main radio station in Russia, from Echo of Moscow. I was banned from the independent internet-based television channel called Rain. I was not, and still not even welcomed there because of the pressure on them, because I was saying all of these things, what would happen next, including the cutting Russia off the SWIFT system. It would be regarded by the Russian functionaries around Putin as an act of war. However, in reality, that wouldn't mean that Russia would be completely cut off from international financial markets. SWIFT is just an electronic system of payments. And then you just go back to dark ages and do, payments in pre-SWIFT ways. However, it may also hurt some of the international investors, because they expect coupons from their sovereign bonds, to be wired to their accounts via SWIFT payments. That, the entire cutting off SWIFT would cause some, earthquake in the international financial markets, because the total amount of outstanding Russian debt, sovereign debt and corporate debt taken together, these are several $100 billion in value. But, it's not going to end Putin's regime. I fail to see how even that measure would end Putin's regime. What would end Putin's regime over time is sanctioning more and more people on a personal level, those people who actually benefit from the system of kleptocracy, who actually steal the money from Russia, from the Russian taxpayers, from the budget, and export this money to the West and build their lifestyles around these cash assets which they exported. They buy villas, they buy hotels, they invest in Western companies, they build their own web of offshore shareholder structures where they end up owning villas on the coasts of Italy, France, and Spain, and nobody knows who the owners are.
I know.
And so sanctioning these people for their dirty money and freezing their assets, this would cause the Putin's regime to collapse in the most practical way, for the way I see it, over certain reasonable period of time. I see no other way to actually help Russia to get rid of these criminals.
And to finish, what about the European Union? For example, what do you think about the European Union support to the Russian opposition? Does it really exist, and how does the opposition and average Russians perceive the role played by the European Union?
Well, the opposition in Russia cannot appeal to international community on the basis of their day-to-day work, and also translating this to the people at large. We cannot appeal to foreign countries to help us to get rid of the illegitimate Putin's regime, and so on and so forth. This has to be done by the Russians internally, somehow, over in a fight against the dictatorship. So we cannot appeal to the world on a daily basis. But what we can do and must do and are doing is that the international community must not only do the blah blah thing, but also act on joint commitments to international agreements. So if Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, occupied eastern Ukraine, and it also annexed and occupied Crimea, then the United Kingdom and the United States of America should have come forward and used their power to throw Russia out of Ukraine based on the commitments signed by those states in, I believe, 1994,
Bucharest,
under the Budapest Agreement, where Ukraine was giving up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for the guarantee of its territorial integrity, signed by the heads of state of the US, UK, and Russia under Yeltsin.
Yeah.
And I have to remind everybody that Ukrainian nuclear arsenal at the time was the third largest in the world, which Ukraine gave up.
Yeah, I know.
So where are the US and the UK under the Budapest Memorandum? Where were they? Where are they now?
Yes, that was in 1994, and nothing was done frankly, nothing was done to support this agreement.
We can, fast forward all of these years up to 2020, and maybe not even to 2020, but rather to the year when the Skripals, the father and daughter of Skripals, were poisoned in Salisbury in the UK. That was an act of international terrorism carried out by Putin's regime on the soil of a country which is the member of NATO, where chemical weapons were used and where UK citizens died. Russia is under international obligations in this respect. And when you, as a state, violate these obligations, there are consequences to that. Now, at that time, Donald Trump was in the Oval Office in the US. He had to act based on a specific law which was adopted, back, I believe in 1991, if I'm not mistaken, based on the some other precedents in different parts of the world, I believe, in using chemical weapons in Syria. Mm-hmm. And the US has this law, which is not a presidential decree. It is not some kind of a recommendation. It is actually a law passed in the US, which is a law in existence where the US government must act on the law against the perpetrators, against the violators of the international treaty on banning chemical weapons. And the US did not act to the full extent on that law based on the Skripal's Novichok poisoning in the UK. This led to what happened in 2020 with Alexei Navalny and Putin using Novichok on him, because he and his regime went unpunished from the Skripal's situation. US did not act on its own law, but it had an obligation to do that. I can only interpret that as Donald Trump being a lapdog of Putin while in the office, being actually held by Putin by his balls based on some kind of compromising stuff that we are yet to find out, where Donald Trump was actually not acting on anything. And now there is no excuse for Biden, for President Biden. There is no excuse for other leaders of the international community of not acting, or of what Putin has done again using chemical weapons.
Yeah, I agree. But I think for Trump, maybe we will find some compromise.
Yes, and again, these are the actions that Russian political opposition is not asking the international community to actually undertake. This is the other way around. The international community has an obligation based on their previous agreements and obligations to do something about Russia, which is violating its own international obligations. The international community must act based on its own laws and agreements.
I agree. To finish, the visit of Joseph Borrell to Moscow, and in the EU we are very disappointed about this visit, and we think, what is the real appetite of the Russians for more democracy and a relation with the EU? Because of this visit of Joseph Borrell, we are like under shock.
Well, I can only say that it's too bad that civilized world does no longer have leaders of the merits of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in respect to the rebirth of the evil empire. And Putin's Russia is actually an evil empire, and maybe to some extent is even more dangerous than the Soviet Union. So I am also disappointed, to say the least, and agree with you of what you just said. and European Union has to get its act together. And if it is difficult to do in a unified kind of all EU way, then somebody has to take the lead. Whether it's heads of state of France or Germany or somebody else, somebody has to take the lead and actually look up into their own international obligations and laws, and see what the real consequences should be bared by the violator in this respect, Putin's Russia, what they must do according to their own obligations. And so this is all just a bunch of BS where you go back and forth for 7 years after the downing of Boeing and the war against Ukraine. You're going back and forth, and the Putin's regime is getting more and more crazy, absolutely crazy. What has been happening, Olivier, over the last several weeks here in Russia is just difficult to explain to normal people. But you know, I'm almost sure that most of your viewers have seen at least this shocking footage on major channels internationally, how Putin's special police, so-called National Guard, is what they do to the peaceful demonstrators who came out in the streets according to the 31st article of the Russian Constitution, which gives them the right to assemble peacefully without arms and protest. These protests are made illegal here in Russia by Putin's clique. The constitution is in fact abolished and dismantled. There is no longer the right to go out in the streets, which is guaranteed by this now piece of paper, which is nothing but a toilet paper. And what other people in the normal world see on their television screens is just shocking. And this is only escalating. And putting sanctions against the Putin's regime for that is not some sort of the meddling in Russian internal affairs. It is complete bullshit of the Putin's propaganda, like it was back in the Soviet days with the same argument. It's not. The Soviet Union, especially in the Brezhnev years, since 1970s, and Russia post-Soviet, they are signatories to major international agreements guaranteeing human rights. And the violation of human rights in Russia is not and cannot be, it will never be, just the internal affairs of Russia. It is the also an obligation of international community to uphold human rights in Russia. And Putin and his regime must face consequences for what they have been doing with the human rights in Russia over the last years, and especially over the course of last weeks.
Merci beaucoup, Slava. That was very nice. To this interview was amazing, and a very long interview, but you know very well you know very well the subject. You know very well what to say, and for me personally, that was very interesting. Then, thank you very much, Slava. We will put that on our YouTube, and see you soon, or on the phone, or because we have a lot of common friends. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for inviting. Bye bye.